So we are going to take just a second and sing a song, kind of bring a devotional experience here. We're doing this on Sabbath. It's not just an academic journey. It is a journey that will involve kind of the stretching of probably your previous ways of looking at the book of Daniel, because we're going to have our scholars up here talking from a variety of points of view, including a linguistic or language one. So let's take our hymn books out, sing an early Advent hymn, How Far From Home, 439. 439, take your hymn books out, and let's sing all four verses of 439. And let's stand together while we sing. How far from home, I asked as on I bent my steps, the watchman spake, the long dark night is almost gone, the morning soon will break. Then weep no more, but speed thy flight, with hope's bright star, thy guiding ray, till thou shalt reach the realms of light in everlasting day. I asked the warrior on the field, this was his soul inspiring song. With courage bold the sword I'll wield, the battle is not long. Then weep no more, but well endure the conflict till thy work is done. For this we know the prize is sure when victory is won. Third verse. I asked again, o'er sea and sun seemed with one voice to make reply. Time's wasting sands are nearly run, eternity is nigh. Then weep no more, with warning tones, portentous signs are thickening round. The whole creation waiting groans to hear the trumpet sound. 439. Not far from home, oh blessed thought, the traveler's lonely heart to cheer, which oft a healing balm has brought and dried the mourner's tear. Then weep no more, since we shall meet where weary footsteps never roam. Our trials past, our joys complete, safe in our Father's home. I invite you to bow your heads as we pray. Lord, thank you so much for this freedom to gather. Not only for that, for the many blessings of having the university close and those that have gathered in this community for meetings here this week. We are thankful, Lord, for the time, energy, and focus that has brought this convocation together, this symposium. Please bless us in our last session here this afternoon. May we not be overwhelmed, but may we take away something, and may we all gain and grow. So now, Lord, we ask your Spirit to be here to teach, and that our hearts would be open to discern and to learn. In Jesus' name, amen. Please be seated. Now, we are getting ready to enter into the last segment. For those of you that weren't able to be here, you can watch online. On Thursday, we had 4 different presentations, very excellent presentations. One of them, if you were at Sabbath school, you've seen already. So the one on whether or not Ellen White endorses the view as Turkey as the king of the north in the book of Daniel chapter 11. That question as to whether or not she endorses it was discussed this morning at the Sabbath school time. So if you've seen that, you saw one of the 3. But they are online. You can get online and watch them. They're very good. Yesterday, we started into a serious look at the text itself, looking at the original Hebrew language. These individuals on the platform behind us are gifted in those things. They have studied and they are examining the scripture with a special focus on what the author appears to have intended. You may not realize this, but when Daniel and Revelation was written, not the inspired books of the Bible, but Uriah Smith's commentary, he did not have the access, or at least was not himself gifted with the original languages. So his interpretations, which have benefited many, have been adjusted at times along the way as we've learned more. So you will have a chance to ask questions. Sometimes you might be wondering, what question would I ask? But as you listen, you will take something away. We will take breaks at the top of the hour, and we will conclude our afternoon session today at 5 o'clock. So this will be a fairly academic look with an attempt to build a bridge to those of us who don't know Hebrew. But they're going to have, as you can see on the screen, or you will in a moment, they're going to have both the English translation and the Hebrew on the screen, different ones of them with different perspectives. We will look also a little bit at how history impacts this. And so there was summarized for us by a former dean of our seminary, Dr. Denny 14, 3 different components that build into our understanding of the book of Daniel. And that is, we see how history fits its development, and we've tried to connect it with history. We're looking this afternoon at how the language itself gives us understanding. And then also we can see themes and types and symbols in the Bible, especially as they focus around Christ, also developing our understanding. So, one last time, you're going to feel a little bit overwhelmed at times at what's about to happen, but that's not bad. You'll come away with a little more than you had before. Don't be discouraged by that. Be paying attention as they try to build a bridge between their expertise and our ability to grow in a knowledge of this. All right, Dr. Vine, I will turn the time over to you, and any further things you want to say about process would be good.
Thank you very much, Pastor Kelly, and welcome back, everybody. And for those of you online, we're delighted you can be joining us. If you have a question during today, just wave your hand around. I'll be sitting up here. If I see your arm waving, Pastor Kelly will bring a microphone for you, and we'll take your question. If you would rather not ask it publicly, you can email me from your cell phone, conradvine@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to kind of look at it. And if you're at home, send a message via that same email address, conradvine@gmail.com. With us this afternoon, we have a selection of some of the brightest minds from around the world in the Hebrew language. We have Dr. Roy Gane, Old Testament scholar from Andrews University, Dr. McGuire-Moushon. Yes, also an Old Testament scholar. Dr. Samuel Nunez, a now retired professor of Hebrew linguistics and many years' experience teaching Hebrew. Professor Tarsee Li from Oakwood University, also a Hebrew professor. And Professor Jerome Skinner from the seminary here, Old Testament professor. And then we have Dr. Michael Younker, also, well, he's not at the Andrews just yet. He will be one day. I think that's his destiny. But he has just completed his Old Testament doctorate, and he is working at the Archives Department of the General Conference, has a keen interest in history, as I'm sure is going to shine through as he contributes today. And then finally we have Dr. Martin Probstle from Austria, a Hebrew scholar par excellence, and we're delighted that he can be with us here today. And we're hoping that one other professor will join us, Oliver Glanz. We have an empty chair here ready for him, assuming he turns up. So yesterday we went through some of the earlier texts in Daniel 11 where there is agreement, and we also covered some of the texts where there is some disagreement. And I'd like to invite you, if you have your Bibles with you, you may want to keep them open at the book of Daniel, chapter 11. And one of the reasons we study Daniel is precisely because we see so much fulfilled prophecy in it. And it brings comfort to our hearts, the message that God is in control of history, and He's bringing it to a climax in His time. Now, for this afternoon's session, rather than go through the text verse by verse, because we're never going to get through it if we do that in 3 hours, we have about 5 or 6 questions that we're going to focus on, so that I'm just going to briefly go through those now, so that you as a panel can be thinking about those. And in the congregation, we're hoping we're touching on the key issues for those of us who are engaged in Daniel 11 study. The first of the questions we're going to ask is in Daniel chapter 11, and this is, let me just find it here. It's verse 31. The question there is the Tamid. The rise of atheism in the world. So we're going to be asking the question, who is this king who suddenly appears on the scene, or appears to, within the passage? We'll then move to the question of verse 40. It says, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him." And the question before us is, when is the time of the end? It's a critical question, and Adventist scholars have gone back and forth between 1798 AD, the end of the papal supremacy in Europe when the Pope was deposed by General Berthier from Napoleon Bonaparte, or is this 1843, 1844, as we come to the end of the 23-year 100 prophecy? Now, the significance of that question is that Uriah Smith's commentaries in the late 1890s made great play of the fact that the time of the end begins in 1798, literally, and that's when we get Napoleon invading Egypt. And so we're going to ask that question. And then we're going to come on to 1141 and 1145. The text refers to the beautiful land and the beautiful holy mountain. Are we to understand these literally, or are we to understand these in another sense? And if we have time, we'll come on to 1144, news from the east and the north. What is that? What is being referred to here by the news from the east and the north? And so we're hoping that as we look at these questions, these are kind of the key questions that many people have as they look through this passage. And so we'll begin, maybe we'll ask the first question to our panel. There in verse 31, the text says, "Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate." And this really sounds like biblical language, the abomination that makes desolate. And so if we could ask our panel, how is there anything in the Hebrew language that indicates how best to interpret these two phrases?
Well, for one thing, we can very quickly do a word search on the word Tamid, find out where it's used elsewhere in the book of Daniel, and that will give us a clue. It's not just that one word by itself, but if it's a similar context, then it can give us a clue what it is here. So we'll do that right now real quick.
Okay, so Gane is now going to do a quick word search. With computers, it's all much easier these days. He'll pull up the instances of where this word Tamid, which is daily, where it appears elsewhere in the book of Daniel.
Okay, and the word doesn't mean daily because it could refer to the weekly changed bread of the presence in the sanctuary, so the word means regular or regularly. Here are the instances in the book of Daniel, okay? And this is, it acted arrogantly against the prince. This is speaking of the little horn in Daniel 8, verse 11, from whom the regular, all of the translations say daily sacrifice because they're influenced by the idea that Antiochus Epiphanes was the little horn, and he took away the daily sacrifice in Jerusalem. So we have to realize we've got to be careful reading these English translations of Daniel because they are influenced by those theories. So the word doesn't mean daily sacrifice. Ellen White was correct when she said that the word sacrifice is supplied in the text. She said that. She recognized that. And she was right, even though she didn't know Hebrew. And so here it is. That's speaking of the little horn power in Daniel 8. And then we get in verse 12, the same thing. And then we get 8:13, summarizing, referring to the same thing. And then we get our verse here, 11:31. And then we get another one, which is very crucial, and that is 12:11. From the time that the Tamid, the regularity or regular, is removed, and the abomination that causes desolate, that's Shikutz Shomem, is set in place, there are 1,290 days. Now, we didn't mention this passage yesterday. We mentioned Daniel 8, where the little horn is the papacy. But here, this seems to give a very clear indication that this Tamid is taken away at the beginning of the 1290 days, which must represent years. We don't have to get into that whole discussion. We could, but I think everyone understands that.
Well, we do have some people here who don't have much history in Adventism, so just to keep everybody up to speed with this, there is a general rule in prophetic interpretation that a year in these apocalyptic prophecies, a day equals a year. And so when it says 1260 days, it's talking about a real-time period of 1260 years. And we don't have the time to go into all that now,
yeah,
but
and
that is a
the Hebrew word, the plural of yom, this Hebrew word, can mean either day or year. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so it just depends on the context. If it's too long a period of time to be literal days, then it must be years. Just like also weeks in Daniel 9, 24 to 27. If you look up in the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, not written by Adventists, Köhler and Baumgartner. Köhler was a member of the Nazi Party, actually. And so there they say Shavua, the word for week, can be either a week of literal days or a week of years. Mm-hmm. And they put the Daniel 9 instances under week of years, simply because the context demands that.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the challenge of the Hebrew language, whereas with Greek, words have much more precision. With Hebrew language, the word meaning often is determined by the context. So, Brother Martin, you have some thoughts on this question?
I have some thoughts on the first phrase, hatamid, the daily or the regularly, as Roy indicated. It appears 140 times in the Old Testament. Probably Roy can show that on the screen as well. And the 140 times are distributed, if you look through that, in about 80 times it is in a cultic context. And this is important because in Daniel 8 it appears for the first time, 3 times, as just Roy said. And there it's a cultic context. It's this Celtic war of the horn against the host and the prince of the host.
So by cultic you mean this is a religious expression?
It has to do with religion, it has to do with worship, mm-hmm. and Tamid, in fact, if you look back then where it is used mainly, almost exclusively, if you are referring to the cultic context, in the context of the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. You go daily and do the daily offering. Morning and evening is one daily offering, you do that. Or you go and trim the lights daily, tamid, in the evening. Or you go and exchange the bread regularly, weekly, on the Sabbath day. So whatever you do, the tamid activity actually is done by a priest. Most often it's the high priest. And it has to do with an object or a person which is related to, in some kind, to the worship of Israel, the worship of God. And this is important. So it's a positive term. Mm-hmm. I know that there have been a few Adventists who think that the daily is more like a negative term. It has to do with heathen. Is that right? Heidentum?
Paganism.
Paganism,
You're right.
Thank you.
No, William Miller had that idea.
Paganism, but if you look through the context how it is used, the paganism idea, which is proposed by some, can only come in if the paganism is lifted up in Daniel 8:11. Usually the translation is the tamid is taken away. But if you take the tamid away, if you take paganism away, it's positive. But so the people who say it's paganism, they need to go with a translation of the verb there, which means you lift it up, you make it more prominent, this paganism. But if you look now in the translation of that verb, which is used in Daniel 8:11 for tamid, this taking away or lifting up, the lifting up only occurs in a social context where a group of people are lifted up to a new position. A higher position. So it's kind of, knighting somebody, becoming a more important person in administry or administration. In the cultic context, it's always always used the same verb herim, or from room, to take away. So if it's taken away, the Tamid needs to be positive. So my conclusion is the Tamid is something which has to do specifically with the worship in Israel. Now in Daniel it's 5 times used with an article, ha-Tamid. Nothing else. It's the Tamid, as if you know what the Tamid is. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I say the water bottle, I mean a specific water bottle. Mm-hmm. So if I say the Tamid, I think it means it's a specific Tamid. And the Tamid has become later on, after Daniel, a term which is used in rabbinic literature for all of what they do in the cultic worship at Israel. So I think we are on a good term based on the Pentateuch relationship of the word Tamid in a cultic context and how it is later used, and the ha-Tamid, the article of the Tamid, that this is in essence the worship of God. Mm-hmm. Either by the high priest who contributes to this regular worship activity, or maybe, and I suggested that in the dissertation, maybe it is also related to Daniel 6, verse 17 and 21, where in the Aramaic an adverb is used which is a one-to-one translation, has a one-to-one translation relationship to Tamid. But it's a different word, it's a different language. The word is todira. So if you look in Daniel 6, verse 17 and 21, I hope in the English it's the same because you have a verse off, right? Yeah. Is it 17 and 21? It's there, todira, okay. And it's for 17 or 18? Is it 18? I don't know. Look it up.
Verse 20.
Okay, so it's verse 16 and 20, okay? I know, I always wonder why the English translations are so off in comparison to the Hebrew and the German, of course. That's okay, a little bit, that's the British humor, I guess. Oliver, come up here, yeah?
Welcome.
Okay, so in 6:17 or 6:16, now in English, and verse 20, you have it used for the word, here in my translation, it's continually. And you can immediately sense it's the same thing, regularly, daily, continually. And Daniel is doing here something interesting. He worships, serves God continually. So he's doing we could call it, he cultically, religiously worships God. And of course, if you look further on how he does that, 3 times a day toward Jerusalem, temple in mind. I mean, for Daniel, he is continuing the temple worship in exile in Babylon. And I think that is also a relation we should take into consideration, so that we can say the Tamid is not only what the high priest is doing, but it's also what the people like Daniel are doing. They are worshiping God. And in Daniel 8, in the 3 times there, in Daniel 11 and 31 and Daniel 12:11, it's always taken away. So somebody, some entity is taking away the worship which belongs actually to God and putting it in a total different context. Okay. For me, it seems that this expresses that worship which has been directed toward the living God is now directed towards somebody else. And that is shikutz.
That is what?
Okay, that is...
the abomination.
That's an abomination, exactly. Abomination is a religious term for wrong worship, idol worship. It's used in the prophets many times, sometimes, and to erect the shikutz, the abomination, is in direct relation to taking away the true worship. So somebody takes away the true worship, and instead of that places wrong worship.
And is that word shekutz related to Shekinah? No.
No.
Okay. Brother Jerome, you have some input on this?
Sure. Say you don't have the benefit of knowing Hebrew and Aramaic, okay? You can read the English text and even get a sense that we're talking about not paganism, that we're talking about something religious that has to do with the cultic world of the ritual world of Israel. So yesterday I mentioned if you just track the contrast and the conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south in chapter 11, that's one of the strongest keys to let you know what type of activity we should be looking for in history, okay? So from chapter 28 on, we know that there's a specific focus now on the king of the north. Sorry, I'll try to keep this closer to my mouth. Just look at the verbs in English, and I will begin to give you an indication of what type of activity that we're talking about. Through verse 25, the language has been primarily militarily active, okay? Coming and attacking. And when you get to 28, you notice that there's a shift to more religious language. For instance, he talks about magnifying himself, exalting himself, prospering, honoring, kalal, or profaning. With the wisdom thing is there, the concentration is on he doesn't worship the God of his fathers. So even if you only know English, there's things that you can pay attention to in the text to let us know we have a shift in the type of activity. Therefore, the way that we understand these words also has to shift with the type of activity that is now in focus. And just in verse 31, look at the words that you have. Profane the sanctuary, take away the daily, and will make the abomination causing desolation. Just in that verse alone, you know that you have an emphasis on something religious. So it's not just talking about taking away something militarily. There is a religious ethos, and just in this passage, and even in the larger section, you have the words berit, and you have more sanctuary language. So you don't have to know Greek and Hebrew to understand this, just at the narrative flow throughout the text.
So what you're saying, Brother Jerome, is that as we work our way through the chapter, this power, in say verse 29 onwards, it seems to move from a military phase to a spiritual phase, and it's actually engaged in an attack on the worship of God.
Right. The military phase is still there because even in verse 33, you talk about sword, flame, and captivity, but the main focus is religious.
And you mentioned the word the abomination that desolates. When I was growing up, my father was asked as a pastor, would he like to go to a certain city? And he said, no, that's the abomination of desolation. And so we were sent there by the conference. And I always wondered, what is this abomination of desolation, or the abomination that desolates? Because it's a very strong phrase. And you mentioned in your comments on it that once we take away the Tamid, the daily, the regular worship of God, you establish in its place something else. And you reference that as the abomination that desolates. Would you like to comment more?
As Martin said, the word really is used of idols, idol worship. So it's false worship, as Martin correctly said. And so you have the taking away of something and the replacing it. This is replacement theology. Mm-hmm. So what's taken away is apparently the regular worship of God by his people. And if you take that worship away from Christ, he's no longer treated as divine. There were three major views of the so-called daily, which is regular. The Reformation view had more this view that Martin and I hold, that it's the regular worship of God by his people based upon the usage in the Old Testament. And then the second view is the so-called old view of the daily of William Miller, that it was paganism, and that's based upon 2 Thessalonians 2, where there is the man of sin, the man of lawlessness, and then something has to be taken away for him to be set up in his place. And so they figured it was paganism, pagan Rome had to be taken out of the way for papacy, the papal Rome, to be set up. And that's really based upon reading a certain view of 2 Thessalonians 2 into Daniel. So it's a form of eisegesis. Then the so-called new view of the daily is that, in fact, the Tamid is Christ's ministry, because we now have the heavenly temple, so it must be Christ's ministry in the heavenly temple.
Based on Hebrews chapter 9.
Yeah, but then the problem with that is that, of course, how could an earthly power affect something in heaven like that? Nothing can take away Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. It just can't be done. And so people have said, well, in the minds of the people, subjective. But that really comes back then to Martin's view and mine, and that is, it's really the worship of God, because that's what it was in the ancient sanctuary. They would bring their sacrifices or whatever they did, and it was service for the Lord. It was their worship. And that's what's disrupted during the 42 months in Revelation 11, where it says, measure the temple and those that are therein. That's the heavenly temple. Can't touch it because it's in heaven. And measure the altar. Okay, so they're in good shape. You can measure them, right? But don't measure the court. That's on the earth around the altar, because it's going to be given over to the Gentiles to be trampled for 42 months. And that's persecution, disrupting the regular worship of God by his people. Just one other brief point in terms of language to back up what Martin was saying about this verb huram is the way the rabbis read it, but it was originally herim, either an active or a passive, but it means to cause to set up, or be caused to set up, or to be caused to lift up and taken away. That's the idea of lifting off and taking away, like part of the burnt offering in Leviticus 1:14 and following. How do we know that this means take away and not lift up? Well, because when we go to the parallel passage in Daniel 11:31, we have another verb, and it's hasir, hifil of a different root. So it's causative of turn aside. Now, these are synonyms, but in one particular area. They don't mean the same thing, but if you took a Venn diagram, they would overlap in one area, and that is take away. Turn aside to take away, lift off and take away. That's where they intersect. And so that's how we know that the meaning here in both passages is take away. Aside from the contextual indicators that have been mentioned, Jerome and Martin, you were saying it's a good thing that is taken away. I think Martin said that, and you were saying the same thing. And it's cultic. That is to say, by cultic we mean has to do with worship, basically.
So my takeaway from this conversation is that this passage is talking about a force on earth, a power on earth, that is seeking to detract from the worship of the true God among his people and to put in its place a false system of worship.
And the false system is idolatrous, shikuts.
Okay, Jerome?
Just one more point to strengthen the argument of both. This word shikuts is used in a very familiar passage to Adventists, and that's in the book of Ezekiel. Remember when the angel takes Ezekiel on this trip throughout the temple and vision, what does he see? He sees these false idols and this false worship replacing the true worship. And that false worship, that idolatrous vile worship, is called shikuts. So if you want to just have an analogous picture in your head of false worship replacing the true, using this word, you can just look to Ezekiel chapter 5, Ezekiel chapter 7 and 11. So that gives a more concrete picture of what does it look like to replace true worship with false worship.
Okay. A question, yes, Brother Martin.
I wonder what my colleagues would think about that if you look at the semantic field of the entities which are attacked by, I guess it's the King of the North. We see in verse 31 where you have the Tamid that it says something like there's the Holy Covenant goes against the Holy Covenant. Verse 31 later on, the people who know their God will resist him. Those who are wise, the many, the rabbim, often used for very positive people following God. Again, some of the wise. So you get the idea, the attack is against people, which bolsters the view that Tamid has to do with what the people do. They bring worship to their God. If you attract the people's attention to somebody else, away from God, it's taking the Tamid away from God. Later on, from verse 36, the semantic field of the attacker changes. There it starts with, he will do as he pleases, magnify himself, which of course rings a bell like Daniel 8:11. There's also magnification. But then it goes above every god, and the God of gods, the gods of the ancestors, the one desired by the woman, any god, God of fortresses, God unknown, foreign god. So the attack there is clearly against God. Mm-hmm. So for me, it seems we have these two entities again, which are attacked by this despicable power. It's one, the people of God, and then directly God himself. And that fits what we have throughout the book of Daniel, starting from Daniel 1, going to Daniel 8, which is always the same thing. It attacks the people of God, and then it attacks God. So it seems to me we have here two thematic parts, maybe even corresponding, and not so much as we argued yesterday or looked for yesterday, is there a chronological following up? I mean, is it a sequential thing, or is it a topical description of what the king of the north is doing?
Well, it's very interesting that when Saul was going to Damascus to imprison the Christians in Acts chapter 9, when Jesus appeared to him, he said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And so an attack on God's people on earth, God also interprets it as an attack on himself personally. Right. And so it's no surprise that we see in this passage this power on earth that is attacking the worship of God's saints on earth, and then it moves into an attack directly on God, you might say. And so those two things do seem to be linked. When God's people are persecuted, it's an attack on God himself. We may see those two aspects in these two portions of this chapter. We have a question from Pastor Tim here.
I just want to back up Martin on this one with something.
Can you speak up, Tim?
As he was talking, I was looking at a pattern and seeing it in Daniel 11. In verses 25 to 30, that is military language, but the target is the king of the south through that whole period. Then in verses 31 to 39, would be a part of a pivot point. The target is now God and God's people. And then in verses 40 to 43, the target is the king of the south. And verse 44, the target is God's people again. It's following a pattern. Whatever it does to the king of the south, it then turns around and does to God and God's people.
Okay, Roy?
Good point. Thank you.
Okay. Can you just explain a bit more what Roy was just sharing to us? I'm still in my post-lunch low blood sugar. I'm not sure what's happening to me here. So I'm sure we'd appreciate a bit more elucidation on that point.
Yeah, he's pointing out that when the king of the north attacks the king of the south, that then is the first antagonist. And then after that, whether it has to go home or whether it prevails, going home earlier eventually, after it's finished with the king of the south, then it attacks the people of God, which did happen in history in the past. And we can expect it in the future. And this often happens. You notice in history that a country develops a lot of military power by prevailing over or fighting with one group, and then it turns and it uses that on another. It can develop that power. Like, we could give many examples in history, but that often happens. And here it becomes then a religious war. They take all that infrastructure, all that power, and then they turned it. And they did on the Albigenses and other groups in Europe after fighting in the Middle East.
So we have a question that's coming on my email here from somebody who has a lot of knowledge of European history. And the question is, when we see this persecution, it seems of a spiritual nature, in verses, say, 31, 32, 33, and 34, it talks about a lot of persecution of the saints of God. Does this power that's persecuting act on its own, or does it work through civil actors or civil agencies? The person has mentioned to me the persecution of the Huguenots, the Albigensian Crusades, the Waldensian Crusades, and all the persecutions that took place in Europe during the Dark Ages. And the question is, does this religious power sometimes ally itself with civil powers in order to carry out its persecution? Do we have an answer? Yes, we'll come to you, brother, in a moment. Yes, Brother Nunez.
I'd like to speak first about the vile man that acts in Daniel 11:30 and following verses. For me, the vile man of Daniel 21,
Brother Nunez, can you put it?
yes, is parallel with the little horn of Daniel 8. The little horn of Daniel 8 represents Rome, and the vile man of Daniel 11:21 represents also Rome.
Just so everybody understands, if you look in verse 21 of Daniel 11, it talks there about a vile or a contemptible person will come into royal majesty. That is the vile person that you're referring to.
Right.
A new power enters the scene.
Right. After introducing the little horn, Daniel says that the little horn grew toward the south, toward the east, and toward the sea. Some say that indicates the beautiful temple or the beautiful land. In other words, Rome, in his aspiration of world dominion, starts toward the south, then goes toward the east, and then goes toward the beautiful land. For me, the vile man or contemptible person of Daniel 11, in his actions, goes first to the south, according to Daniel 11:25. In verse 30, now he is in the beautiful land. And verse 30 says that identity, Rome, shall be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant is related to the Jewish people. And we see that not only in the text, but we find that it is fulfilled in history. The Holy Covenant is the Old Covenant first, the covenant that God made with Israel. After Jesus' death, then the covenant is related to the Christian church, and it is called the New Covenant. But here in verse 30, we see in prophecy that Rome is enraged against the Holy Covenant, against the Jews, takes action, and pays heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. And in verse 31 says that forces belonging to Rome. The Hebrew word that in verse 21 that is translated as forces or armies, the literal meaning of that word is arms. But it was used by Gabriel as a figure of language. And the arms is used to indicate armies or forces that belong to Rome and stand up and desecrate the temple, stronghold, fortress.
Okay, so brother, the question I asked,
Yes.
which has come through, is this persecuting power, because most Adventists see this as Rome in its papal phase during the Dark Ages. Does Rome operate purely on its own? There were papal armies, or does it work through civil partners in its persecution? Maybe Roy can answer that question directly.
I put up the verse that answers this, Daniel 8:24. His power shall be great, and this is referring also to the papacy, but not by his own power. Velo bekoho. So this means that he uses proxies, he uses allies. And we see this in the book of Revelation. End-time Babylon is allied with these other powers. Just briefly, in a very brief response, and then I think we need to move on to verse 36. Back to Daniel 11 here. Once we hit that point of verse 22, I think we agreed that after that we're in the time of Christ. So the despicable person or contemptible person or vile person in 11:21 is Rome, a Roman power, whether a specific emperor there or more likely perhaps the line of emperors, of imperial Roman pagan emperors. It's not the papacy. And then we get the cross here, and then we have a transition to papacy. And then in verse 31, I think we've agreed to summarize here that we've talked about the papacy taking away the worship of God's people, which was done by force through persecution. So force is appropriate here. And then setting up an idolatrous worship system. And then we get the persecution during the Middle Ages. And then we get to verse 36, the king shall do as he wills. Maybe we should start in on that.
Yeah, we'll come to that just after our break in 5 minutes. We have a question from down here, and then Brother Tarsee. Yes, brother?
Brother Vine, I don't know if this is the right time to say what is in my mind and my heart, hearing about the Tamid. Could I say what I have in my mind?
Yes, if you can keep it short, we're about to take a break.
Short,
yes.
Of course. Years ago, I had the privilege of hearing a presentation by Dr. Probstle. I don't know, forgive me my German. And in that presentation, he projected on the screen his own translation of the Hebrew to the English language. And in that translation, that was a special moment in my life of a Seventh-day Adventist, because he translated, instead of the place of his sanctuary, his translation was the foundation of his sanctuary. To me, it was something that hit me like a ball of fire. Foundation. Oh, the majority of the text translations, they say the place. But Dr. Probstle's translation was the foundation. Then I went to the American translation. It's a Roman Catholic. And in that translation, he says, the scholar says, the base. Oh, wow, the base, the foundation. So, knowing that this is a cosmic war, we cannot live with the early kings and the early sanctuary. We have to go to the sanctuary in heaven, and we have to go to the King of Kings. In my opinion, this is a war of character. And what the little horn took away is the man of sin, took away the Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant is in the Holy Sanctuary in heaven. And the foundation of that sanctuary is that Holy Covenant because it represents the character of God. It's a word of character. The character of God and the character of the man of sin. So the man of sin took away that character in heaven and here. He tried in heaven and here on earth, and he's going to do it again. And by the way, please, this is the last few things. For the scholars, be scholars. I respect the scholarship, but talk also as an evangelist to tell people in money that we can deal with.
All right, so let's ask our scholars the question. Roy, you have it up on the screen there. Does this word say the foundation or the place of his sanctuary?
Yeah, most translations, you're right, say the place. And, for example, ESV, the place of his sanctuary. However, the Catholic version, the New Jerusalem Bible, says the foundation of his sanctuary. And here I'm looking at the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, which is the most detailed Hebrew lexicon. Place, foundation, place, site. Now, interestingly, it's basically the temple platform. It's the place where it is, and that's where the court is. And according to Revelation 11, the court is supposed to not be measured because it's going to be trampled. That's what's trampled. That's on earth. The temple is in heaven, the court is on earth, and that's trampled by persecution. And that's exactly what Daniel is talking about. It makes perfect sense. Thank you for bringing it up, brother. That word is machon, and it does not mean it's not makom. Makom with a kof means place. This is machon. Kun is to establish, or a place of establishment, or a site, or a foundation. And you're absolutely right. Thank you.
And for those unfamiliar with what you're talking about, the book of Hebrews talks about Jesus as the mediator of a better covenant, and he ministers in the heavenly high sanctuary, and that is the high sanctuary where worship takes place. The man of sin, or this persecuting power, seeks to obscure Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary, where Christ presents the saints of the brothers and sisters. Brother Tarsee, and then we'll take our first break.
I'm just looking at this and asking, to what extent can we say that the context in this part of the chapter is descriptive rather than narrative? Because that makes a lot of difference, okay? When you talk about the abomination that makes desolate, or the abomination of desolation, Jesus applied that to the Roman armies, and that would not be papal Rome. Mm-hmm. And yet, in the context here, it can certainly apply the other way as well, which makes me wonder, is this part of Daniel 11 trying to lay things out in temporal succession necessarily, or is it simply giving us a description?
Mm. That's a very good point, but it is 3 o'clock. We will take a break now.
That before 3 o'clock.
Oh, you did you? All right, if you can keep it brief, Brother Martin.
I'm always brief.
Oh, thank you.
Even if it's long, it's very brief, you know?
As another famous Martin Luther says, I can do no other.
Yes, okay. And in the end he said, no, without any quibbles, and then another 5 minutes. Okay. I wanted to say two things. Thank you for bringing out the machon. And Roy, in Psalm 89, verse 15, the machon is used metaphorically because there it says that righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Grace and truth go before his face. Mm-hmm. So there is also not only a literal application to that, so it speaks of the base foundation of what the sanctuary message is all about. And the second thing, listening to Samuel and Tarsee, I have the feeling that both of them would go a little bit in the direction to say maybe verse 31 has to do with 70 AD, or also?
No. Also perhaps, but not necessarily limited. In other words, Is it restricted to a specific time? You see, if we're trying to look at it temporally, then we need to ask ourselves, well, which phase of the King of the North? What time, and so on. But if it's simply describing that then it doesn't matter. Both of them, it can apply to both periods.
Well, Daniel 9:27, which I have up here, says, "On the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate." So that's where you get that language for the first time in the book of Daniel. You get Pesha Shomem in Daniel 8, but here it's Shikutzim Meshomem. So Shikutz shows up, and this is speaking of 70 AD, right? Primarily to start with, but then Ellen White in Matthew 24 has then the next application. She says Jesus telescoped the presentation. So this is 70 AD, but then he was putting together, and during the Middle Ages, you also had this other one during the time of the papacy, and that's what Daniel 11:31 has to be talking about in the context of that chapter. So this chapter is 70, Daniel 11:31 is time of the papacy.
So as we take our break here, there was...
Unfortunately, I couldn't ask my question.
What I'm questioning is whether the dichotomy is necessary. That's all.
My question would be to the New Testament and Old Testament scholars, and both of them. Let's give a good explanation what Jesus is doing in Matthew 24, verse 15, please.
All right. Roy, are you going to come with that text, or we're going to take a break? All right.
We can think about it during the break.
We will take a break. I found it fascinating so far, and we're going to move on. And straight after the break, the question will be in verse 36. Who is the king that appears in 36? We hope to cover that question and the time of the end. When does that begin? After the break. So we'll gather back at 3:15. Thank you very much.
All right, folks, welcome back. The sessions are going to go pretty quick. I think you're going to find that the little bit of time we have will be used up rapidly. So we've already gone through more than a third of what's set aside this afternoon, so thank you for your attentiveness to the front. And of course, sometimes, very good. All of our panelists are there. Dr. Vine, let's go.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. And we're delighted to start the second of our 3 segments this afternoon. Thank you for the questions that have been coming in. We've had to do some questions and answering in the break, actually. One of the questions came up was, what does Sister White say about the abomination of desolation? We know it's the initial application is the fall of Jerusalem, when the Romans destroyed the temple and put their pagan standards there. But the question is, what does she say about it in the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages? And so we've been speaking with Pastor William Fagel, and he's prayerfully considering whether to write a paper on this. And if he does, then it'll come to the steering committee and they'll consider it. And if they think it's fine, then it may get put on the website. So there's a lot of subjunctive clauses in that. So I would ask you to pray for Pastor William Fagel as he thinks about whether he wants to put a paper together on that matter. You may want to encourage him today before the day is over on the question. So we're going to move on now to a question that, two questions. One is verse 36 and the other is verse 40. If you can pull those up for us, Roy. Verse 36 talks about a king who seems to exalt himself. From verse 36 on, the king shall act as he please. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. And I was raised an Adventist, and as I've read a lot of material on this topic, it struck me that there are many, many parallels with the little horn power of Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and 2 Thessalonians 2. The parallels are so many and so obvious that it seems to me that this must be referring to the same power. But I'd like to ask the question of the scholars here. Which do we see those parallels with Daniel 7, little horn, Daniel 8, little horn, and the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2? And if those really are, those parallels mean this is a same identification, who would this power be? So we give this to our panel here.
May I say something here that, dealing with methodology, and I'm coming at it as someone who I don't understand the entire chapter. I'm just being honest about that, okay? But I hear different views on this chapter here. And I wonder if, rather than nailing down the answers, what we want to nail down is the relationships between chapters, the syntax, the language, the text, so that we all have the same basis on which to discuss different views that we may have. Just question. I don't mean to put that out, instead of the question you're asking, but just adding to it.
I think it's a very fair question to ask, but let's come back to the question, because many people ask this of verse 36. And sometimes it says the king, some people, they turn it into the king of the north. They add the phrase of the north. They assume it's the king of the north. Roy, you're going to have some comments on this verse?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I don't think we should add anything to the text, but it's been talking about what this one does, and then we have Hamelech, so with a definite article, which indicates it seems to be a continuation. But notice that this portion of Daniel 11, the biggest portion of Daniel 11 devoted to any one power is to the papacy here. And it's really in different sections. Now, to say that any one of these sections has to follow the other chronologically is difficult, because each one of them really covers the whole gamut of the history. In terms of who this is, 2 Thessalonians 2, the parallel is so overwhelming here. This has to be the blasphemous, lawless one, man of sin. You get it in Revelation 13 and so on and so forth. But interestingly, it matches history as well, because we've talked about the chronological flow in this chapter, but it was really just after the Crusades began and the fall of Constantinople. Greg Bratcher mentioned to me just during the break that at the Fourth Lateran Council, transubstantiation became dogma under Innocent III in 1215 AD. The Crusades began in 1095 under Urban II. And so it's true that the whole period, the papal period, began in 508 to 508 to 539, along in that area, and 538 rather. And then, but then there was a development throughout this whole period, and then as you get later on, we have the impression that there's an intensification. Yes, this was really going through the whole period, but there was also a historical intensification of this blasphemy, with particularly reached a very high point under Innocent III.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Martin?
I come from the Hebrew language here, and I read in verse 36 that the king will do as he pleases. In the Hebrew, a phrase is used there in 36, the kirtzono, which appears several times before. The first time in Daniel 8, and I like Daniel 8, of course. And there it appears when a power comes to the height of its power. When this entity comes to a height, you can do what you want, and you think you can go away with it. But then in Daniel 8, right after that phrase is used there, the power is about to fall. So if you rise up your head above the clouds, you will certainly fall down. And similar things happen here in chapter 11.
So you're talking about the little horn power in the middle of chapter 8 there, that exalted itself?
No, I'm talking, that was the first one, I think, was the ram, the horn of,
okay,
or maybe the horn of Greece. You have it up there in verse 4.
Okay.
Okay, so in verse 4 you have the ram, and he goes in the 3 different directions, and no other animal can stand before him. Standing, terminology again in Daniel 11, a main word there. And nobody can help, and he does, ve'asa kirtzono, it's the same phrase, he does as he wishes, so to speak. And he makes himself great, vehiktil. He magnifies himself, or itself. And that means you raise your head above, and then you will fall. Haughtiness before the fall. Or how does that Proverbs 16 say?
Pride goeth before
Pride
a fall.
before the fall. And a similar thing happens in chapter 11, verse 3. And that is, of course, as we say, one of the kings there, 11:16. Same thing there, because later on, he goes right after that to the downfall until verse 19, and now here in 11:36 the same. When this king does as he pleases, that means he has been there before in the narrative. It must be the same thing before. Now, before, there was not the king in verses 33 to 35. It's talking about the vice. It's not talking about the king there. So I think it needs to pick up the topic again, and it's used the Hamelech. It needs to be addressed as now it's going to talk about the Hamelech, the king, in verse 36 again. And you have to say that so that you know, okay, now we are back to the king, which was before. And so I think this king there in 11:36 is the same acting in 31 to and so on. But what it means historically, well, that you have to ask the historians.
Okay. Well, the essential
just looking
point
here
is
at the text, that this is clearly the same flow. And it has been broken, kind of an offshoot narrative, what's going on with God's people, with the vice there, and so on. Now back to the king. And by the way, the king, he has now the power. But that indicates already this king will fall. We have to wait a little bit until he falls. It's similar in Daniel 8 for the little horn. Does as he pleases there, and it succeeds. And the fall, you have to wait until 8:14. When does it fall? Finally.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is this is a power that is a persecuting power. It engages in military action. It engages in, should we say, spiritual warfare against the worship of God. And it's also a proud power that it's going to fall one day.
Military actions, I'm not so sure, but yeah, spiritual
attack. Okay. Oliver?
Perhaps another observation in this first clause of verse 36. The focus is actually not on the king. The focus is, it's kind of misleading in the English. It reads, I'm having here the ESV, it says, and the king shall do as he wills. So in the Hebrew, the king is, the subject is actually at the end of the clause, so you should translate, and he shall do as he wills, the king. So it seems that the text assumes that you might be confused about who is actually doing what he wills. So therefore, you just reintroduce, or you make the participant explicit. But the text really wants to focus that the action, namely that he is doing what he wants, is part of the sequence that you have as actions listed before. So the text assumes that perhaps the reader might have forgotten who's the actor. So there are a lot of actions taking place, and by verse 36, let me remind you again, it's the king. And then the question is, of course, who is the king?
Okay.
And then you have these signal words, because the actions mentioned there indicates this power will come to a fall. That's what I read there.
Well, that is truly good news if it's a blasphemous and a persecuting power, that it will come to an end. Yes, Brother Samuel?
Yes. The king in Hebrew is a determined word. That means that this king was spoken before. He was active before.
In the chapter?
In the chapter.
Yes.
And we have seen from verse 21 till this verse, there are only two kings, the king of the north, the contemptible person, and the king of the south. This king should be either the king of the north or the king of the south. Since in verse 40, the king of the south attacks this king, then the king of verse 36 cannot be the king of the south. Who is then?
He must be the king of the north.
The king of the north. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here then Brother Jerome, Pastor Ed Nelson.
It's a little more of a comment here. The other thing that I find very compelling is the end of this verse says that he will prosper. Salach is the same Hebrew word that shows up in the activity of the little horn.
In Daniel 8.
In Daniel 8, that he causes these things, he causes deceit, mirma, to prosper, but he will prosper until the indignation. In Daniel 8, I think verse 19, the angel says that I've come to let you know what will take place at the end, in the latter part of the indignation. In other words, and I believe that's a reference to a little bit later where it says in Daniel 8, 25, that he will be broken without human hand, essentially. That this power is prospering right now, but he's going to come to his end. And the power that's been working in the preceding verses that has been taking away the cultic, the worship of God, putting himself in that place, persecuting the host, the people who know their God, all of these things. Verse 36, and as was previously mentioned, 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4, I believe is actually quoting from this verse. So there's all kinds of reasons to see that this is a continuation of what's the power that's been working in the previous verses.
Okay, Brother Roy, do you have that text there from 2 Thessalonians for us? Okay. Who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So this is almost a blasphemous power, but in the end of chapter 40, yet shall come to his end with no one to help him. That mirrors the end of the little horn power of Daniel 8 that says he shall be broken and not by human hands. So they seem to have the same characteristics and the same kind of end in mind. Brother Jerome.
Sure. Actually, there's 4 more connections in verse 36 with Daniel 8 when it's talking about the little horn, just to shore up your argument. I mentioned yesterday, it may not be obvious to people who's reading the English version, but in Hebrew, the way that Daniel seems to be communicating in chapter 11 is he will make literary units, okay? So he'll use the same kind of literary structures to let you know that you're looking at a unit. For those that weren't here yesterday, I showed in verse 17, 18, and 19, it all starts the same way in Hebrew. That way letting you know, hey, look at this as a literary unit. To try to make easily accessible to your minds what Oliver and Martin and Samuel were talking about. So chapter 11, verse 32 through 35 all begin the same way with participles, okay? And it's all reference to the covenant. So it's like a parenthesis statement about people in reference to the covenant. That's why they're saying that verse 36 picks back up from verse 31. So it will be like a parenthetical statement. So on one hand, in verse 31, you're saying what this persecuting power is doing in terms of its religious apostasy. And then you have like a literary unit inserted that talks about the people of God in reference to the covenant. And then in verse 36, you pick back up. That's why this Hamelech, this noun, has an article to point you back to something that occurred before. Mm-hmm. So I don't see this as an introduction of someone new. It's just saying, oh, I was talking about the people of the covenant. Okay, now I'm going back to what I was talking about before.
It's very interesting because the Uriah Smith interpretation introduces a whole new power into the chapter in this verse. It talks about the French Revolution. What I'm hearing you say is that the expression Hamelech, the king, is pointing us out to the fact that this is a continuation of the actions of an actor who's already in this chapter. So that would kind of write out the possibility of this being the French Revolution as a brand new actor. Brother Oliver.
I would be careful. I agree with what Jerome was saying, but I think I would be careful with speaking. What do we speak about when we speak about sequence? Do we speak about a temporal sequence? Do we speak about a sequence of participants? Because, and I guess that's a discussion that is really at the bottom of all of this. Is this a narration? Is this narrative prose? Or what type of text do we have in front of us? And if you look from a linguistic perspective at this text, this is not a narrative. It's not a narrative text. You don't have any typical Hebrew tense forms that would indicate that, Vayiktols. It's basically a discursive text. It's direct speech text. And in direct speech, we have many of those types of texts in the Old Testament. There is not necessarily a sequence of actions always discussed, but there are other levels of sequences discussed. So it can very well be that verse 36 is not describing actions that come after, now speaking historically or chronologically, that comes after the actions of 31 till 35. It could be an action that is parallel to these actions. So I think that's a methodological debate that we would have to have. What type of text do we have in front of us? What do these verbal forms or these VAV conjunctions, these and this happens and this happens and this happens, is this a sequence of chronological aligned actions, or is this a sequence of actions that could also be described parallel or without chronological framework?
Okay, thank you. We actually have an interesting question that's just come in, if I can pull it up here. And it relates back to the question of the Tamid. And the question is this. Just read it as it's written. Could the possibility be that Jesus' reference to the abomination in Matthew 24:15 refers only to Daniel 9:27, since there is no mention of Tamid in that verse? In other words, taking away the Tamid and the abomination does not refer to Rome in AD 70, and always when you have the taking away of the Tamid and the abomination together, this refers to something other than Rome, i.e. Sur plus Tamid plus Shomem equals not Rome, but only Shomem equals Rome. Is that a possibility? It's kind of an interesting question. Roy, you have some thoughts on that?
We have Matthew 24:15 up here in the English and the Greek. It only mentions in this verse the abomination of desolation. It doesn't mention the taking away of the Tamid. And in Daniel 9:27 that we pointed out before, I guess I don't have it here anymore, it mentions only the abomination, desolating abomination that's coming. It doesn't mention the taking away of the Tamid. Now, I don't know if that is relevant to it. As Ellen White says, Jesus was telescoping things for his disciples because they couldn't have endured if they had understood the true horror of this repetition of history. Now, we don't have, whether we call that typology or not, it's repetition of history that's being telescoping. It's multiple, in a sense, multiple fulfillments of that in a way. People call this Matthew 24 a kind of an apocalypse. It's really not. It's not within the genre of the apocalyptic literature, but it is definitely eschatological. It's pointing forward to the end. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Brother Tarsee.
Yeah, when we talked about the so-called daily, the Tamid, we concluded that it had to do with service and worship. And we talked about how the word had this occultic terminology, is a cultic term, okay? And so the translation, daily sacrifice, may of course be wrong, but that it has something to do with worship and service is there. And when Jesus spoke in Matthew 24, he was talking about the temple being destroyed, not one stone being left upon another. So, yes, he didn't use the word Tamid there, but definitely he's talking about the destruction of the temple service.
That's a very fair answer.
But
yes.
he's also talking about the end of the world and the Great Tribulation. When you get to verse 21, you see it's talking about the Great Tribulation, which has not been from the beginning until now. And that's language, again, from Daniel, right? So, from Daniel 12:1. So.
Okay, so if what I'm hearing you, Brother Tarsee, is that when Jesus is speaking in Matthew 24, he is speaking about the literal destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, and he's not only speaking of the events of Daniel 9:27.
Say it again.
Well, what I heard you say is when Jesus spoke in Matthew 24:15, he was explicitly referencing the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yes, it does have a dual application.
Yes.
But the reason why we know it refers to the Roman armies is because of the parallel text in Luke, where Luke definitely explains it as the Roman armies.
Yes.
Okay. But it does have the dual fulfillment.
Okay. We have a question from here. Your name, brother, please?
Rudy.
Yes.
No, my question is talking about, this linguistic is on translations and all this. What would you recommend the best English translation for us to read Daniel 11? There's so many versions. Which one is the best one that you recommend to the public to read?
Well, one of the challenges we have,
in Hebrew,
in reading Daniel 11 in Hebrew, it's a very difficult text in Hebrew. Okay, number one, Daniel is post-exilic. So the Hebrew of Daniel is not quite the same as the older classical Hebrew. And Daniel seems to break some rules now and then that, those who first learn Hebrew learn. So that's one issue. The other issue is that Daniel's language seems to be mysterious in some ways. Okay, he uses a lot of passive verbs. And when you read it in Hebrew, you have all these pronouns. He, him, and so on. And who is it referring to? Well, Daniel isn't always clear. So I wish I could give you the perfect translation, but I'm afraid that the perfect translation will depend on how you interpret the chapter.
Okay, Oliver?
Yeah, so this is really a question on translation theory, you could say. And it relates to the text in the sense of that this is a text that has, linguists would say, a lot of underdetermination. So, for example, the pronouns. I'm here in verse 15, for example, or let's go here to verse 27. And as for the two kings, right? We have two kings, and then we have some plurals. They do this, they shall speak. And then verse 28, and he shall return. So who is he? So that's the linguistic underdetermination. That means the text does not give you any grammatical hint about who is he. And of this type of underdetermination, you have a lot. The whole text is flooded with these types of underdeterminations. So now how to solve this? There are two ways of approaching this. The one is to find out whether in the Hebrew that Daniel was using, which is probably post-exilic Hebrew. Many argue even that this is written in the Maccabean time, and then you have the Maccabean thesis and this kind of things. But there's some linguistic arguments that are behind that. So the one question is, what type of grammatical codes does that type of Hebrew use in order to create referential coherence, also in order to define who is he? So there are certain, every language has certain type of grammatical rule book that they follow in order to define who is he or who is she or who is they, to define the references. So it might be that Daniel uses a different type of referential system than, for example, the Pentateuch uses, or the book of Genesis. So this is one front that we need to explore before we can actually start identifying participants in this text. And on the other side, even if we find a rule book that helps us to clear out some of those references, there will still be underdetermination in the text. Because at the moment where you speak an English sentence, you will have underdetermination, and people have to figure out, they have to add to what you're saying some clues in order to make sense out of your speaking. So there, really the historical analysis is necessary, because only with the historical analysis certain referential links could be established. But first we would have to start with a linguistic model that helps us to clear out everything that is actually determined, and then define what is underdetermined. And when we have the underdetermined group, then we can start historical guessworks, so to say, and see whether we find a model that actually makes this fit.
To use a modern analogy, when my boy sends me a text message as a teenager, it's very brief and punctuated and abbreviated. And somebody reading it in 5 years' time, reading these historical texts, would have no idea what we were saying, because it is so underdefined, the actual language that's being used.
So I think for everybody who is engaging in interpretation, we would have to come together, and we want to have a common ground. We would have first come together and say, what is clear and what is unclear? And first create a clear list of what is clearly referentially identifiable, what is not. And then from there on, we can go further.
Okay, Amanda?
But I think from the lay perspective, if you are not working from a Hebrew text, one of the things I tell my students that when they go out into ministry and they get these questions from their parishioners is just tell people not to get too stuck in one specific translation. Don't say, well, this translation is the one I like. I'm only going to stick with this one. You need to look at a number of translations, because, people didn't, I don't know why there's so much feedback, people didn't come up with translations out of nowhere. They had reasons for the choices they made when they were translating. And so you can look at a couple different versions and see, why did they translate it this way? Why did they translate it another way? And then be aware, you need to figure out, then as a believer, you can look at the rest of the Bible and say, well, how do I understand this based on this information? But there is no one perfect translation.
Okay, thank you. Pastor Kelly?
For those of you who weren't here, on Thursday we had a presentation by Dr. Fortin. And in that, this underdetermination forces us to lean a little bit on the three historicist models of trying to understand this. So we have the Uriah Smith historical emphasis, and because we have a outline in Daniel, we are somewhat dependent on a variation of these dynamics. So we have exegetical scholars whose emphasis is language, but thank you, Dr. Glanz, for your observations, because in the end, it really is pushing us to a team effort to understand. And we're benefited when we can gather in harmony and respect for each other and do this. So you aren't going to find one, is what they're saying. And thank you, Dr. Amanda, for your observations. Let's let them keep going forward. Dr. Gane had an observation, but that presentation by Dr. Fortin is on the website, and I encourage you to watch it, because we have these three ways of looking at it, and all three of them are going to be necessary.
I just want to add, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tarsee.
Well, I just want to add to your observation about the historical part. I am with Martin that we need to figure out, and well, some others of us that we need, but he's the one who said it a lot. We need to figure out first what the text says, yeah? But on the other hand, I see the need for the historical fulfillments, because I remember being in a linguistics class where the teacher asked the question, if you're faced with a text in an unknown language, how do you decipher it? What do you need in order to decipher it? And the answer to that was, you need to know what it's talking about. And so it's the same thing here. We cannot avoid asking the question, okay, what would be the fulfillment of this? Although I prefer to start with the text.
Roy?
Yeah, to answer that question just a little bit, every translation is a commentary. Okay, let that sink in. Every translation is a commentary. The Bible is a library of documents that are written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Every translation is a commentary. Now, I was the primary translator for the Common English Bible, so I learned on Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, I had to translate, and then I went to a scholar at Emory University, a friend of mine, and then we worked together, and then we gave it to the editors, and the editors tried to put it in English that an 8th grader could understand, and they messed up our translation. So I don't recommend the Common English Bible of Leviticus. But I learned a lot about how translation works, and it's scholars like us who do translation with our assumptions, with our interpretations. They're all going into that translation. So don't rely, I totally agree with Amanda, don't rely on any one. Now, some of them, when I've done commentary work, I was writing the NIV application commentary on Leviticus and Numbers, but I couldn't really use the NIV because it was too loose. It's too close to a paraphrase. I found that the NASB 1995 is much tighter. It doesn't flow as smoothly, but it's closer to the original. The NKJV is fairly close to the original, but it's not as up to date on some other things. NRSV is up to date on a lot of scholarly things, but they do some textual criticism. For example, in Daniel 8:24, where it says, "But not by his own power," they just pull it out because it's not in the Septuagint. Okay, so these are just a few examples. The one that I use more than anything else is the ESV, the English Standard Version. I find that it's good, it's up to date. I know some of the people who were involved in that, evangelicals with a high view of Scripture. Now, we don't agree with everything, and when you come to Daniel, you still get these assumptions about Antiochus Epiphanes. One that is very helpful, another approach, is not just using a translation, but one that has translation notes. The Net Bible, the New English Translation, which I put up here, has translation notes, and I'm just clicking on that, and here's all these translators' notes discussing the reasons why they translated things a certain way. It's very helpful. Another thing that you can do that's a good idea, and I know that Ron Nutt will appreciate me saying that, use the Andrews Study Bible. Yes, the Andrews Study Bible. Now, it so happens that I wrote the part on Daniel, but the end of Daniel has it been updated, Ron? Because before, the editors just pulled out what I wrote on Daniel 11:40 to 45. It was too radical, so they just pulled that out and said we don't know what it means. But did that get updated, Ron? I don't know. You have to get it to find out. Okay. Very good. Okay. I know we were working on an update. I don't know. But I know it's come out again with another translation. And so, in any case, but the rest of Daniel, I'm not just saying that you have to agree with me or you have to get it because I wrote that, but I'm just saying that it does give. You see, when you're doing a translation, when a translator, like a scholar like us, is doing a translation, you have very little leeway. You know, you've got this word you've got to translate by a word, even though there's no one word that's really appropriate. When you have translator's notes or you have a commentary like the Andrew Study Bible, you get to explain. You can do more stuff with it, and so you get a lot more out of it. Okay, I'll just leave it there.
I'm saying this prayerfully, knowing that I'm really putting my foot in the fire. This morning on my prayer walk, I was listening to Testimonies, Volume 5, the chapter on the mysteries of the Bible, a proof of its inspiration. And it was humbling because Ellen White reminded me of something. And she said that there are some things that educated men, with all the knowledge and all the skills, when they come to the text, they have no clue what it's talking about. But she said the layperson who is under the control of the Spirit of God can read that exact same passage and understand it. I don't want anyone to leave here feeling like you have to know Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, and you have to have all this literary skill and literary knowledge. As you can see, the scholars up here have some of it, and we don't agree on everything. We have to depend on the Spirit of God. And I do go to the original languages and all that, but that will never bring anyone to some ex cathedra, statement about the Bible. So all these suggestions are great, but I fear someone is going to leave here thinking they can't understand the Word of God. Take the comments that were made, but all of us, no matter how skilled we are, need to depend on the Spirit of God. That's what Daniel had to do. When he said, I didn't understand, heaven came and helped him. So take courage, brother. Don't feel like you have to know all of these things that we're trying to wrestle with just to understand the Word of God. And I felt like that needed to be said, lest someone leave here disheartened, like they can't understand the Bible.
Yeah, and part of what we tried to do in this seminar, we haven't done it this afternoon, but we had 4 sessions of prayer, not just quick prayer, but every morning and every afternoon after lunch, we stopped and gathered in groups to pray because we value our scholars, we respect their training and their willingness to come share it with us. But they, as well stated here, and they're all shaking their heads, understand as we do that it is a very Spirit-led, not in absence of learning, but in cooperation with it. So,
okay, thank you. We have a question back there from our brother. And brother, if you can keep it quick on this. We're going to take a break just after 4 o'clock. We are going to get to the timing of the time at the end. That's the first question after the break. So, brother, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Odika is the name. So, concerning the question, which translation, what was said is very useful. But I wanted to highlight that the method of translation helps with the accuracy of the message. For example, paraphrases, dynamic translation, formal translation. So we would want to go for a Bible that would more be in the formal translation area, where the persons translating were mostly trying to put over the message rather than trying to understand everything for themselves before they actually come up with a interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
So I think that would be useful.
Thank you, brother. We have about 5 minutes for our break, and so I want to ask Pastor Dr. Michael Younker here. You've done a lot of research on the ships of Kittim, the ships of that particular verse there. It's found in Daniel 11, verse 30, for ships of Kittim shall come against him. In 5 minutes, can you summarize the learning you and your father, the research you've done, and how this impacts our understanding of this chapter?
Yes. One of the challenges, of course, as has been discussed here, is that the Hebrew and the grammar, the syntax, etc., are very complicated. Pronouns are abundant, and it's very hard to understand it. But one of the outstanding features that I think is worthy of special focus, and most interpreters do agree, is where there are place names. Finally we have something a little more solid than just north, south, etc. Daniel does not have very many specific place names. It introduces Persia and Greece there in verses 2 and 3, so we kind of have a grounding of something to start us off. And then in verse 8, it mentions Egypt, which helps us understand that the king of the south very likely is the power that's controlling Egypt, and historians have built off of that. After verse 8, and this chapter has 45 verses, as most readers will be well aware, there are lots of place names in 41 to 44. Lots is happening there. In between, however, there is only one other verse that has a specific place name, and that's in verse 30, and that there it refers to the ships of Kittim. This word, Kittim, has been the subject of considerable debate and dialogue, and lots of different translations have been generated about it. I'm going to suggest what recent research is showing us may help clarify at least the meaning of Kittim. It does not determine the interpretation or the historical application, but there are some directions that are the contemporary movement that we're seeing in scholarship is trying to redefine and sharpen the meaning of Kittim. One of the things that has made this important within Adventist circles is that Uriah Smith understood it as Western Islands, not actually a specific place, but a very generic, broad region, kind of Western Islands in the Mediterranean area, so lots of coasts, islands, etc. The basic origin of that translation of the idea that Kittim means Western Islands comes from Josephus. And Josephus was a Jew captured by the Romans who was a historian, and that by itself, the fact that he's a Jew that becomes dominated by Roman culture and context may help explain what's going on with why he understands it the way that he does, and it helps bring us into some of the history. He says that for the Jews, Kittim can mean Cyprus. In fact, he actually says that that's the primary meaning. But for the Jews, it also means maybe the Greeks or the Romans or anyone to the west. Okay, now Josephus, of course, is a very early person in history when it comes to understanding the Bible. We're talking back to the first century here. And because of that very long history and his endorsement of it having expanded meanings, lots of other commentators since then, we're now talking 2,000 years almost of commentaries, have tried to massage the different meanings into Kittim. Now, as we dig a little bit deeper behind Josephus, we realize that he's reacting to lots of Jews around that time, from the 2nd century, 1st century BC up through the 1st century AD. There was lots of Jewish communities, one of the prominent ones being the Qumran community, that were very interested in apocalypse. And they were, by this time, of course, they had the book of Daniel, and they were trying to interpret Daniel to fit their timeline. So they were trying to incorporate the interpretation of, in fact, Daniel 11:30 into their flow of history. And so they began to speculate and introduce the idea of really symbolism, symbolic interpretations into the interpretation of Daniel already here in the BC, already before Christ. They were already doing this, and they suggested that it could mean, of course, perhaps the Romans. And so this interpretation became very common again already by the time of Christ. However, if you actually go outside of the Jewish literature and you actually go into the archaeological world of other cultures and other serious people using the word Kittim, you will find that it does not have any other meaning other than Cyprus. And there is new research that has come out. Tom Davies is one archaeologist and scholar who has looked at this. He's written a recent 2015 article. And there's a variety of others, Cypriot archaeologists, many of whom have no interest in Daniel, whether they're religious or Christian or not. They are coming to understand, because they're aware of the Jewish background of the word, that Kittim really does just mean Cyprus. This has some significance, of course, if we're trying to understand the prophecy as literal. If Egypt means Egypt, then Kittim means Kittim, or means Cyprus, etc. There's more I could say. I think our time is going to run out, and maybe we can return to it later. But there is one other word that also is of interest, and it goes with it, and that's that there are ships of Kittim, or Kittim ships. And the word for ships also may be particular, and if you actually understand the ships of Kittim as a combination, it does appear also in Numbers 24:24, Balaam's oracles. And we do understand that prophecy of Balaam, which refers to ships of Kittim, to very likely, in fact, we think it has been fulfilled as the sea peoples or the Philistines who come and invade and conquer some people north of Israel and then are ultimately destroyed themselves. Beyond that, I think I'll leave it at that. And
Okay, thank you very much, Brother Michael. We're going to take a break now, but before we do, Brother Luke, Brother Walker. Brother Walker is not just a scholar at the seminary, he's also a poet. And he's going to close out this session. He's written a very short poem relating to the study of Daniel 11, and it's a beautiful little poem, and it shows the spirit in which we come to this study. So thank you for sharing it with us, brother.
Yes, thank you very much. Poem written yesterday after the session. We have come together, in unity we stand, to look on Daniel 11 theme and strand, to wrestle with its text and interpretation, because its concept we want to clearly understand. Let's rely on the one who has given the message as we grapple with this text, with this passage. The true meaning is not easy to be unpackaged, but with patience, thought, prayer, let's take courage. Look deeply into all of its thought progression, using literary, contextual, and grammatical constructions, cross-referencing, line upon line, with careful considerations, yet with tentative awe, we grasp our propositions. Though we are fallen, finite, and distant from its time, we hold its message relevant even for our times, hoping to continue to see more of its truth sublime as we await our Lord for the heavenly climb. God bless
Amen. You. Amen. And with that final thought, we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll gather back at 4:15. We will begin again. This will be our last break before the final sprint to the finish. So thank you.
Okay, folks, the last 45 minutes will go fast, so our break's coming to an end. If you'd come quickly back to your seats. And we are about ready to jump into the last little bit of the chapter. Of course, this will need to be an ongoing study, and we hope you'll do that. There are a lot of papers you can find on the website, and we hope that you'll take advantage of them. And also, if you don't feel comfortable asking your question in front of everyone, as soon as the session ends, jump up there and grab a scholar and ask them what they think. Okay, if we could bring all our conversations to a close, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got about 44 minutes, Dr. Vine.
Okay, thank you very much, Pastor Kelly. And the major focus of this section here is a couple of questions relating to 40 through 45 of chapter 11, particularly the dating of the time of the end. And as you all know, we are now in literally the time of the end for today's seminar. But before we get into the time of the end, we just want to ask Dr. Michael Younker, you kind of introduced the ships of Kittim, or the ships of Kittim. Can you give us just what is the significance of this?
Well, I want to add one thing that I should have mentioned last time, and that is that within the Old Testament, there are only 8 verses that use Kittim, and a couple of them are probably referring to people, and so those are it's not unusual for words to be used for both a person and a place. That's common in every language, but all of the others very likely do mean Cyprus. Can be shown and so forth. When you come to historical application, which is the most dangerous thing that any of us up here would ever venture to do, and it's a challenge to want to do that or not want to do that at times. But if Kittim does mean Cyprus, that does eliminate some possible windows of time and so forth when you could actually have a historical fulfillment, if we are looking for a historicist approach to the chapter. One possibility that has been explored, and I know a couple of us up here share this idea that this could be the fulfillment, is possibly the War of Cyprus, appropriately named, which was in 1570 to 1573, which was at the apex of the Ottoman-Venetian Wars. And this would work well for a fulfillment for several reasons, but one of them has to do with the fact that the word sea, which is the word for ships here in Hebrew, which goes right with the Kittim ships, seems to indicate, and it is a complex thing to trace out the history of naval architecture and so forth of ships, but it does seem to be a particular kind of a ship, and that would be an oared, decked warship. It so happens that the Battle of Lepanto, which was the major centerpiece of the conflict of Cyprus as far as historians are concerned, was the last major naval battle in history to use oared warships. After that, the age of sail was introduced, and thereafter cannons were invented and put on ships, and so having all these extra men for oaring wasn't as efficient as it used to be. So it is possible that we do have an endpoint and perhaps a historical application which might fit. As you go back through history, it's very hard to find very many other events that would be of great significance. I could share more, but I don't know how much to on the War of Cyprus and its significance. I just want to mention that the aftermath of it is as interesting as the Battle of Lepanto itself. In other words, let's call it the War of Cyprus appropriately so, and not the Battle of Lepanto. And the reasons are that is that the papacy itself was especially involved in organizing the northern countries of Christendom to help battle the Ottomans. The Ottomans invaded Cyprus and captured it, and then after that, their ships sailed from Cyprus with their oared ships from Cyprus, ships from Kittim, went up there and encountered the Papal Holy League organized by the Pope, and the Catholic fleet did defeat the Ottomans, but while the Ottomans were defeated, the aftermath of the war, as many historians have noted, because the Papal forces were not willing to follow up and do anything with it, and so the end result was somewhat of a stalemate and kind of a retreat for the Pope, and the Pope was actually very angry when in 1573 the Holy League collapsed. All of the Spanish and the Venetians decided they didn't want to fight the Ottomans anymore. They made long treaties of 10 or 70 years in some cases, and it was all over, and the Pope himself was furious about this. He literally, as one of the original documents says, he sprung up out of his chair and was just livid with the fact that the Holy League was collapsing. So he was grieved. The papacy was grieved, and that seems to fit possibly what's being described described, but that's what we're trying to explore. So.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's come to chapter 11 and verse 40, and we see there the text says, "At the time of the end, or in the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him." And the phrase, "the time of the end," draws our attention. Those who have sort of read Daniel many times know this appears a number of times within the book. And so let's try and dig into this phrase, "at the time of the end," or "in the time of the end." Is there anything significant that stands out in Hebrew that would suggest how we interpret this passage?
Well, the Hebrew term is 8 kates, and kates comes from the root katsatz, that means cutting off. So it's the time of cutting off. So it's a definitive end of one period and beginning of a new era. In 8:17, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision that he has seen, that is the chazon that we've talked about yesterday, the vision as a whole of Daniel 8, is for the time of the end." And the time period in Daniel 8 is the 2300 evening morning that concludes with 1844. However, if we come over to Daniel 12, "Shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end," we find that in verse 7 of chapter 12, he says, "How long shall it be?" In verse 6, says Daniel, "till the end of these wonders." And then the answer is, "for a time, times, and half a time," which Adventists interpret as the 1260 years, ending in 1798. So is it 1844 or is it 1798? And the answer might be, to some extent, both. Because following verse 7, then, "I heard, but I didn't understand," says Daniel. And then he says, "Go your way, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end." And then he comes back with more time periods. And he says, the angel says, "From the time that the regularity is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1335, which Adventists, at least Uriah Smith, and I don't think I can improve on him on this, takes to be terminating in 1843, which would correlate with the idea of 1844 beginning the time of the end. So it gives the possibility that, just as we have two time periods here, well, three really, we got the 1260 years and we got the 1290, which Uriah Smith began the 1260 in 538, and the 1290 beginning 30 years earlier in 508, because there was about a 30-year period of setting up the papacy and its power, its church-state power. And similarly, it seems to be that there may be this transitional period from 1798 to 1844, that the time of the end is ushered in during that period. So to say that it's 1798, sure, beginning again the time of the end. 1844, sure, beginning of the time of the end. But it's really, between there is this threshold period that after 1844, no more biblical time prophecies point beyond 1844. So in that sense, it could be regarded as we're really in the time of the end now. Now, where does that leave interpretations of Daniel 11, verse 40 is the next question.
Mm-hmm. All right, but before we go into that, do the rest of our scholars agree with that understanding that Roy has shared with us? Yes, Jerome?
Right, just to even make that argument stronger, when he says, "Shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end," if you do a comparative analysis of Revelation 10 with the Septuagint, of Daniel 12, John Pauline has made a very strong argument that Revelation in chapter 10 is paralleling Daniel chapter 12. And then that's what leads in his discussion in Revelation 12 when he talks about the 1260. So even in Revelation, when you have parallel usage of language within its larger literary context, it points to that specific time period.
And that would be?
After the 1260.
Okay, so you're suggesting that the time of the end begins in 1798?
Yes, as we traditionally understand it. Yes.
Okay. Yes, Brother Ed Nelson?
There's one other item too connected with this that's mentioned in Daniel 11:35, it says, it talks about the persecution of God's people in the previous verses, that they'll fall by flame, captivity, plunder, and sword. And then it talks about how long they're going to fall for. Some of the wise shall stumble, that they may be refined, purified, and made white, and they will fall until the time of the end. That they're going to be under persecution until the power that's persecuting them, I believe, is cut off. So you have the end of the persecution of God's people that seems to happen at the time of the end. You have the opening, the unsealing of the visions of Daniel that is happening at the time of the end. You have the end of the Chazon of Daniel 8 that is taking place at the time of the end. But I do have a question regarding this because, and my question for our scholars is connected with Daniel 8:17 is the first one. And it's a lamed preposition that prefixes the eight kates, and then you have a different preposition then you have the al preposition in Daniel 11:35, and then in Daniel 11:40 you have is it the beith preposition? And I'm just wondering if you could give us some insight, because they're all translated in a similar way. One is like until the time of the end, one is at the time of the end, another one is like in the time of the end, but they all have these different prepositions in the Hebrew. What light can you shed on what the importance of those prepositions in each one of those verses? Daniel 8:17, 11:35, and 11:40.
That's a great question. Amanda?
Well, with regard to what you have here in Daniel 8:17 with the lamed, it's indicating that it belongs to the time of the end. So that division, la 8 kates, it belongs to the time of the end. So it's a genitival kind of a relationship, which. Right, it belongs to the time of the end.
Okay.
Pointing to and pertaining to.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Pertaining to. All
And
right.
that's talking about 1844, the 2300-year prophecy.
That I will not speak on.
All right. But that does seem, that is the prophecy of that particular chapter. But the other two prepositions that were mentioned, does anybody want to comment on those?
11:35 and 11:40. There's two other prepositions there.
Thank you, Amanda. That was very helpful. Roy?
Prepositions are giving different perspectives on any one thing. You have the same thing, time of the end, and it's looking at it from different ways. So 8:17 is simply saying this vision has to do with the time of the end. That's the topic matter. In 8:35, it's referring to people who are going to be having this experience until a certain termination point, which is the time of the end. And then when we get to 11:40, now we're at the time of the end or during the time of the end. Now the big question there is it exactly in 1798 as Uriah Smith thought, or is it during the period of the time of the end? That is, and it can go either way in terms of the preposition by itself. So it's a matter of context.
Okay, Brother Valiant back there, you have your hand up, and we're delighted you're here all the way from Australia to share in this conference with us, and I think you have some convictions in this area. Yes,
so the first usage is in Daniel 8, which I understand in Daniel 12 there is the 1260, the 1290 and the 1335 that appear there, so it's unclear which one of those the time of the end pertains to. But in Daniel 8 there is only one. There's no confusion over different time periods. There is only the one time period that is in view. Ellen White appears to back up this idea of the time of the end, and Jerome, you were talking about Revelation 10 in relation to this. Revelation 10, we Adventists have understood it to be talking about at the time no longer where, at the time of the great disappointment, the eating of the book, sweet in the mouth, bitter in the belly. Ellen White actually draws a parallel herself between this time of the end concept and the declaration of time no longer. So that would also put it in the period of the 1844, not the 1798. There's no 1260 in Revelation 10. Although there is the, as Pauline has pointed out, there is the interconnectedness there between those two chapters. She also relates the beginning of the time of the end. She says that since 1798, Revelation has been unsealed. The word since indicates sometime after. And in the same context, in Great Controversy, she's saying it is after this time we should look for this, this particular point. So coming from the idea of in chapter 8, there's only the 2300, the connection with Revelation 10, which has to do with the great disappointment, and the her connection saying her statement saying since 1798, sometime after. It does indicate that this is something that we've held traditional, like this is something that's been uncritically held since the days of the pioneers, but from Daniel 8 to Daniel 11, it would appear that this is something that might need to be looked at as later than where we've traditionally placed it.
This is a very significant question. I know that Brendan, you've had a lot of correspondence with Pastor John Whitcomb, who unfortunately isn't with us. And the discussion has arisen, when is this time of the end beginning? Because if you hold to the Uriah Smith understanding of this chapter, it has to be taking place, this verse, in the last couple of months of 1798. But if we push it back to between 1798 and 1843-44, then it kind of casts some doubt on the Uriah Smith interpretation. That's the significance of the dating. We all know we're in the time of the end now, but it does affect our interpretation, that the Uriah Smith interpretive stream of this passage, the dating of this verse here. We have Brother Nelson and then Brother Kier. Brother Nelson, if you could, yes. Just right here. Yes.
A couple things. I think you have to keep in mind the repeat and enlargement that we continue to get through the book of Daniel. And I also think that you have to take the look at the fact that when it says that Daniel's going to go to sleep until the time of the end, or that his book is going to be sealed until the time of the end. And then you see the fact that Ellen White says in A Great Controversy that the book of Daniel was unsealed after 1798. And if you take the logic to it, if you're going to be able to understand the prophecies of Daniel and begin to preach about the second coming of Jesus, and you're going to preach about the 2300 days and the cleansing of the sanctuary, it has to be before 1844.
Okay. Brother Kim Kier, and then I think Brother Brendan has a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off Ed's point there, that in verse 35, you have the persecution ending and at the time of the end. And we know from Ellen White says about 25 years prior to 1798, pretty much all persecution stopped. And you can read that in the Great Controversy. So up to the time of the end, is when the persecution ceases. And then in chapter 12, you have the time the book is sealed. Well, how long? Time times and a half a time. Yeah, but what's going to happen? It's sealed. So you have the book being sealed, and these are bookends, and right in the middle is time times and a half. Then you have perhaps the unintended consequences, this gentleman just said here, that should the time of the end begin in 1844, the book is sealed till the time of the end. If it's still sealed from 1798 to 1844, then the Millerite movement can't really have very good understanding of what's going on, because the book is still sealed. So we have some unintended consequences here of kind of really dumbing down the Millerite movement, and we're kind of putting a weapon in the hands of our critics who don't like the Millerite movement anyway, and it gives them a platform for saying, well, if it's sealed up to 1844, then these Millerites really couldn't have had a good understanding of the prophecies being opened.
Well, the unsealing was a process, and of course, they didn't understand until 1844 that Daniel 8:14 is talking about the heavenly sanctuary. That's a crucial part of the unsealing. So I think that supports my initial statement that 1798 to 1844 is the threshold, that whole period in there, into the period of the time of the end. Because the book of Daniel, yeah, sure, it began to be unsealed in 1798,
Yes.
but it wasn't completely unsealed until then. And in fact, we're trying to unseal Daniel 11
It's
now,
still
aren't
not
we?
unsealed. Yeah.
By God's grace.
All right, Brother Martin, and then Brother Brenton, and then Brother Ed Nelson here. Yes.
I can understand that it is interesting to fix a time point somewhere for the time of the end. But in the book of Daniel, and I have to give credit here to Gerhard Pfandl, who has done an excellent dissertation on the time of the end in the book of Daniel. Maybe you want to read it sometime. I think he concludes that the time of the end is a period at the end of time. There's only one phrase which is going further, and that is the end of the days in Daniel 12:13. But if you see it as a period, now, of course, we want to ask, where does it start? Where does it end? But it's the period in which all of the strands of Daniel come to an end. The persecution will come to an end. Does it mean that the persecution will end until 1798? Not necessarily. It goes until the time of the end. It goes until that period. There might be even a persecution in that period. The other things which are related to the art, to the temporal art, reaching toward the time of the end, it does not mean it ends there. It can still go into the period. Now, when does it start? I think you're right here, Roy, that, and as the other Adventist interpreters have also indicated, it starts probably around 1798 because of the 3.5 times or the 1260 days or the 42 months from Revelation. So we have an indication when it starts, about when it starts. We have a time period which goes for some time. We don't know how long that is, I guess. And when you ask now specifically about verse 40, where the be is used, the preposition be, I mean, the preposition be, le, and que, these are one consonant prepositions. And my Hebrew colleagues correct me here. They occur at least, I mean, be occurs at least 10,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. Lamed appears 15,000 times. Now, we, of course, know what it means here and there. And I think there's 3 books by Ernst Jenny, 3 large, thick books. Just one book about the preposition lamed, going through all the lameds in the Old Testament, going through all the bet, the in here, as it is used here in verse 40, through all in the Old Testament, and categorizing them. Excellent books, I believe.
You're right, 10,162 times. I've got it right here.
Well, that is what your accordance says. And so a lot of things can be said there, but the be here, I think, does not mean that it is the start, right there at the start of 1798, that the action should be envisioned, but it is in the time period of the time of the end. Now, does that exclude that he's not talking about 1798? No. Can it be 1798? Yes. Is it necessary that it is at 1798 that the things happen in verse 48? No. It's just a time period. So I think we need to go back to the historians then and ask, okay, do we find anything which happens like this, that the king of the south is going to engage in battle with the king of the north sometime between 1798 and Jesus coming?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we need to look at the language a little more here, and not just the bet there, but see, this is a very crucial verb right here for answering this question, yitnagach, okay, which is translated generally shall attack, okay? However, it's followed by the preposition im, which means with. So you see, this translation and other translations say, shall attack him. But actually, what the Hebrew says, and this is a hitpa'el, which is reciprocal, and nagach, that root behind this, has the idea of goring or attacking. It's used of the goring ox. And this means lock horns with, basically. So he shall engage in combat with him. That is not speaking about Berthier taking the Pope captive in 1798 and causing the deadly wound. That is not the kind of event it's speaking about. It's talking about engaging in reciprocal battle now, not knocking someone out and then they revive after a long period of time and the mortal wound is healed and so on and so forth. That's simply not that event that's being described in the Hebrew here.
All right, thank you. Brother Ed and then Brother Valiant.
I want to affirm what Brother Martin just shared with us. That was the time of the end is not the instant, it's not when the clock strikes 12, it is the 12 o'clock hour. It is a larger period in which I think we need to recognize that, because Daniel says there's three things that specifically are going to happen within that time. And while two of them happen from the beginning of that time, the Hazon is not fulfilled. It's within that 11 o'clock hour, or however we say it, from that on.
Maybe in colloquial English we say something will happen at midnight. That means something different to say something will happen in the midnight hour. It has a different sense to the meaning. Brother Valiant and then Pastor Tim. And we have only got 15 minutes left, so we're going to have to move on here. Thank you.
I'm not saying that it has to be on the date that it begins, but I'm talking about a terminus post quem that, this is the earliest point. If we can get the earliest point sorted, and if 1798 is the earliest point, then yes, it does allow for 45 years more for this period to be beginning. I believe it's a period. But if it's 1844, we're cutting off 45 years for when this part of the prophecy begins. Now, just from a textual point of view, that's where I start, which is the Daniel 8 and Daniel 11:12. But if we're looking at when the book of Daniel was unsealed, it was unsealed before it was starting to be unsealed before 1798. As anyone who's read Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers knows, a lot of the things that were being preached by the Millerites were already things that had been discovered during Protestant times in terms of the identity of the little horn, and even the 1260 was anticipated. A lot of these time periods were anticipated. Luther said about 200, or was it 200 or 300 years from my time? These things were anticipated. But as Roy was saying, the key feature of what made Daniel unsealed in terms of being able to be understood was what happened in 1844, which was the understanding that this is talking about the judgment, the heavenly sanctuary, and what was going on there. If you're looking at when Daniel was unsealed according to any specific thing that they understood, that's the key one, which sets it at 1844.
Okay, thank you, Pastor Rosenberg.
On this topic, I spent some time searching Ellen White's usage of it, 100 and some references. There's a couple of them that talk about this period of 1798 to 1844 as a growing understanding. There's some that are specific to the beginning of the judgment, and some that are future to events just at the close of time. So that would generally lead to the whole idea it is a general time period.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. I think that accords with the general conclusions that we're hearing around the room here. Brother Martin, do you want to add something to that?
I want to come quickly back to the Yid Nagach here in verse 40. As Roy explained, it's about goring, reciprocal?
Reciprocal.
Reciprocal, okay. Learned a new pronunciation. Reciprocal. Okay, reciprocal action between the king of the south and obviously the king of the north, which is mentioned right afterwards. As I remember correctly, the word is used in other stems, thank you. Then the hitpa'el. The hitpa'el is only here, so it's kind of a so-called hapax legomena, thank you. In the other cases, goring of an ox is usually the idea behind that, goring with a horn, and if I do that, you get a wound. And so, often it's a deadly wound, and it's difficult. to come in the way of an ox. A torero could tell you that with a bull. So, but both of them are doing this. What I want to say is I would not rule out that it is 1798, but it is not necessary that it is 1798. It seems that from verse 40 on, it describes an action which takes some time between the two. And that will be solved only when the king of the north will subdue the king of the south. But it starts somewhere. And it could very well be that it starts 1798. The text does not indicate that. That is according to our historical interpretation again, if it is or if it is not.
Okay, thank you. Oliver?
Yeah, perhaps to throw some further complications into the fire. As an exegete, it's one of the important rules that you follow is that you never just analyze the Hebrew text. You also have to analyze the Greek text. The Greek Old Testament, it has been well received by the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's mostly quoted in the New Testament. And itself opens, of course, a whole different discussion about how does the Greek Old Testament relate to the Hebrew Old Testament. But nevertheless, so it's an essential part of every exegete to, after he has done she has done an analysis of the Hebrew text, also look at the Greek text. Now, when we look at the Greek text, actually, what we see there is, and that's probably a question that would be on the desk of the historians. The Greek text always, when it says the king of the south in the Hebrew, it always says the king of Egypt. And when you have the king of the north in the Hebrew text, it always says the king of the north in the Greek text. So it seems that the Greek text identifies the king of the south as the king of Egypt. In the Hebrew text, it's the king of the south who somehow is having a relationship with Egypt, but it's disconnected. That's why I think Michael can, at the end, say, of course, we have two powers, and you can switch a little bit the location. It's still the idea of the king of the south with this Islamic ideology or countries. So I think here now the question is, why does the Septuagint not have a problem with the identification of the king of the south, but does have a problem with the identification of the north, which is not so much our problem, because we have kind of solved, the king of the north is this power. In addition to perhaps verse 30, where you have the ships of Kittim, the Greek text says actually the Romans. The Romans, it's not the ships or the Kittim ships, but the Romans attack the king of the north, which I think for us it would be, or for you it would be, the ships of Kittim attack, or the Kittim ships attack the king of the north. So
Oliver,
the Greek text would say the Romans attack the imperial Romans, if that...
But Oliver, we always have to make the distinction between the Old Greek and the Theodotian text, which is much closer to the Hebrew.
I'm following here Ralph's critical edition.
Yeah, you need to look at both LXX1 and LXX2, and you see here, the Old Greek is like kind of off, it's doing its own thing. The Theodotian text is closer to the Hebrew.
Can you look it up? Because I only have...
it's right here in front of me.
So what does it say?
In which one?
Theodotian is talking about the king of the south and the king of the north. Old Greek is talking about the king of Egypt and the king of north.
And then in terms of the Rome thing, Old Greek uses Rome, but the Theodotian uses Kittim. It just transliterates it.
So that would be an interesting thing now, because the Old Greek seems to have a difficulty with, let's say, Michael's approach, while the Theodosian's version would allow such an approach.
But the Old Greek has a lot of extrapolations and interpretations throughout it that are very ideologically focused. I did a paper for SBL on 927 showing, looking at it, just the Hebrew, Old Greek, and Theodotian, and Theodotian's just way closer to the Hebrew. And it seems that Old Greek had a lot of ideology it was trying to promote, which you can see with the Rome later.
So can I ask the question, in the Septuagint that is quoted extensively by Paul in the New Testament, the version that he's using, does it refer to the king of the south as the king of Egypt, or some other terminology?
Luckily,
Well-
Paul is not quoting from Daniel, I guess.
Yes, but that version that he's using, he does quote the Septuagint.
But every verse, every book is different.
Yes, you cannot just throw it all in one thing.
All right.
I mean,
Okay.
yesterday I said the Old Greek seems at times, especially if you read Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, it seems to times give an interpretation. Roy said today, every translation is an interpretation. Even a Septuagint, if it is a translation of the Hebrew, is a interpretation. And the Old Greek seems to locate things, that's my impression, but I have to study it more closely. I think it seems to interpret things toward the 2nd century BC.
Mm-hmm.
And
I've got the Old Greek up here, by the way, and the Romans will come and will expel him in verse 30 and so on, and then we got Egypt down in verse 40. But, you know, I don't find the LXX to be very reliable in its interpretation of Daniel. I think we have to stick with the Masoretic text of the Hebrew there. So I agree with Amanda on that. We need to be very careful. It's quite tendentious, that is, it has a certain tendency, the Greek does. But, you know, coming back to this Yit Nagach, I think the preposition im following this is very significant, and how it picks up on that. See, in the Hitpa'el, in Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, it points out here, Hitpa'el, to join in combat with, and they note the preposition here. So it's not just to attack. It's not a unilateral kind of attack. Yes, it is provoking, but then there is fighting, immediate fighting, that goes then back and forth. It's not a knockout punch and then waiting a long time. That's not what the text is describing.
Yeah, we have a final question here, but my comment on Paul is that I wish he'd footnoted his letters. If he were a student, I would have failed him for his cavalier use of the text. We have one final question from a lady back here. Can you give us your name, sister? We need to finish in 5 minutes.
I'm Shami Benjamin. I am original, what you call it, Aramic people from Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you're talking about North and South, always who attacked people of Israel? South, Egypt, North, Babylonian, which is I come from. And now who is those Babylonian? They've been taking over Arab, which is Islamic religion. Who gonna attack the end? The Islamic? With the sorry if we have some Catholic, but not regular Catholic, the original. I mean the
Maronites and the Nestorians, who are the Chaldeans.
If you watch, now they are getting together Islamic and Pope together to attack who? Who not listen to them. The same thing they was attacking Israelites, North and South.
Thank you, sister. And I think behind that comment, there's a lot of pain. What has been happening in Iraq since ISIS particularly, but for centuries before, but particularly since ISIS, the Christians of northern Iraq have been herded into northern Erbil. The Assyrians have been slaughtered or driven out of the country. The Chaldeans, Nestorians, the Church of the East, the Maronites are huddled together in the northern district of Erbil, a district called Anqua, and that's their last stand in northern Iraq.
And that's north of Iraq, which is it is Nineveh.
Yes.
When you hear Mosul, that's Nineveh.
Yes.
And now they are taken over by Muslim.
Yeah.
And those Muslim, how they act, like Babylonian, they was acting before worshiping the idol, and anybody doesn't listen to them, they attack them.
Yeah, thank you, sister.
And the same thing.
I want to thank you, sister. It's a salutary reminder that these are not just figures of history. Real people, the God's people through the ages are suffering, and to this day are suffering immensely. So thank you for sharing with us, sister. To conclude here, we have 5 minutes left. Can we just ask our panel of scholars here, take off your scholars' hats and put on your hat as a Christian. What does this chapter mean to you personally, on a spiritual level? What does this 10 through 12, just in a sentence or so, what does this chapter mean for you as an individual?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that as she was speaking, because we need to think of the overall theological significance. You know, there's these different views. There's historical view, which can be controlled or it can be pin the tail on the donkey. But there's exegesis and theology, and they all have to go together, really. And you're talking about the theological. Ultimately, it needs to be practical. We need to ask the so what question. That's really the most important question. What difference does it make? And for me, this chapter is incredibly powerful in Daniel because it so precisely indicates when Jesus would come, for one thing. Jesus is at the heart of this chapter, as he's so prominent throughout the rest of the book. He's the hero of the whole book, as I think Brendan was mentioning. So the back and forth, king of the north, king of the south, Seleucids, Ptolemies, the angel is revealing to Daniel the things that are going to happen to his people, and he's able to see God has the future in his hands. He knows what's going to happen in a very detailed way, and that inspires me with hope and faith and trust that then the last part of the chapter, I think we're living in the time of 11 verse 40. We're starting to see back and forth thrusting and goring, pushing, locking horns. But because of the way the chapter is being fulfilled historically in a remarkable way, then I'm just seeing a tremendous reliance and trust on God that he's going to bring things through. And that even though we're going to go through this terrible time of trouble, then Michael is going to be there holding us up and protecting us.
Thank you, Roy. Anybody else like to share what this chapter means for you personally? Martin?
Well, I see this chapter as the great conflict. It's throughout the chapter you have basically two forces going against each other. Now, in the great conflict, we see Christ and Satan as Adventists. But here it opens up that the negative side, so to speak, consists of more than just one power. There are at least two powers, maybe three powers, four powers, which are struggling in this world to get the overhand. And while they do that, the people of God suffer. Mm-hmm. Christ suffers. Mm-hmm. The people of God suffers. And this is what we experience. I think we as people of God, we are in a suffering position. This is not our home here. Even though other people want to have the might and the power, we always suffer. And so we are looking forward to a time when we will not suffer. And there will be this Michael who stands up with the same phrase used like with the other ones. And when he stands up, nobody else will stand up anymore. And
Amen.
This is something I look forward to.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Martin. Brother Tarsee?
Amen. You can't study Daniel 11 without Daniel 10 and Daniel 12. It all goes together. And so what I get from the whole context is, at the beginning in Daniel 10, the whole explanation of chapter 11 going into 12 is an answer to prayer. And to me, chapter 10 reminds me of how quickly God hears our prayers. It may seem like it takes a long time, but in the light of eternity, he answers us before we call him. Mm-hmm. And then in chapter 11, I don't have the explanation for all the historical things that are happening here, but you don't need to see that God's people are oppressed, as Martin said. And so this world is not our home. We will face trials in this world. But the good news is that Michael will stand up for us at the end. So that's...
Okay. Thank you very much. Brother Samuel?
What I have learned from Daniel 11 and 12 is that Rome again will persecute God's people. But God's people must not fear, because we have to our side the great Prince Michael, who will defend us.
Amen. Thank you, brother. Brother Jerome?
It's the way chapter 11, if you take the chapters and verses, begins. And that's, yes, we look forward to the time when Michael stands, but what about right now? At the beginning of the chapter, in the beginning of chapter 10, it talks about heaven's activity right now, as Daniel was praying. And so it gives me confidence, yes, I look forward to that time when Michael stands, but even right now, heaven is engaged in a battle for me. Not just for me, but for us. And so when we talk about the second coming, it gives that hope, but we also need to talk about heaven is doing something right now for you to get to that place.
Amen.
And that's what I draw from the book.
Amen. Brother Oliver?
I think for me, one of the most theologically loaded verses is verse 44. And that is, we have this fight between the south and north. The south winds first, then the north winds, then the north winds, then the south winds, then the south, and the north winds, in the end, the north winds. But then verse 44, it says, there is a power always north of north. So, and that power will flood the world, and with that power, actually peace and freedom comes, and not another war. And there's an instructive a word or a verb used in verse 44. It says cherem. It's I think they translate and devote many to destruction. I think that's the translation.
Devote many.
Devote. Thank you. Yeah. So actually, the word there, cherem in Hebrew, it's a theologically loaded word. It basically says, when cherem happens, it's a war of God. So, and when God makes a war, it's not a war to make economic profit. Think about the city of Jericho. They were not allowed to take anything because that was a cherem war. It was a war of God. And usually when human beings try to go into war, they try to get a benefit out of it. They try to get some power, some economic wealth, some advantage out of it. But when God engages in war, men are not allowed to mess it up. So because it's his war, it's not our property, and when he comes, a power north of north, peace and freedom will come.
Okay, thank you. All right. Michael? Okay, thank you, Amanda.
One of the things that I really like about this entire part of Daniel is, it goes through in very intricate detail all of the struggles through chapter 11. And it's leading us, and to the point where you wonder, is there any hope left? And then when you get to the point where you think there is no hope left, then you get to chapter 12, verse 1. And so for me, that's always a reminder when it seems like everything's lost, when it's hopeless, remember, at the end of this dark tunnel, there comes Michael standing up, and eventually, the end, the resurrection, and those of us, hopefully, to eternal life.
Thank you. And Michael?
Yes, as they've all said it very well, but I'd love to read, we focus on chapter 11, but chapter 12 is really the answer and the conclusion to the matter. And when you begin to read after chapter 11, all this history of warring powers, and it does put things in perspective when you understand that it isn't just presented as God versus Satan, but that Satan himself is a divided entity that wars with himself, so to speak. You have different powers vying for control of the world. But when you get to chapter 12, what's so beautiful is that then you begin to read a totally new kind of history. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. And this is part of history. And when you begin to think that way, you understand that there is a special sovereignty that God does have over it, a plan, a direction. History is going somewhere, and that the people of God do have a special place in it.
Amen. Well, that brings us to the close of our annual 11 series together.
So we want to express our thanks to the scholars, if we could give them a hand. Also to the chairperson of our steering committee, Dr. Vine. And we're going to close out with a song, but before we do, I'm going to give you an invitation. We put this seminar on for free, but we spend several $1,000s doing it. We're not taking up an offering, but if it matters enough to you to do something, you can get on our website and make an offering. We are planning to do it again next year, but it's not something that happens without a lot of energy, focus, and effort. We're glad to host it. I've been blessed this last hour, and the discussion on the time of the end would have been worth it all by itself to me. So it was an excellent discussion. But we're going to end on a note of inspiration. So take your hymn books, turn to 598, and we're going to stand together and sing an admonition, 598. Let's stand as we sing. Watch, ye saints, with eyelids waking, lo, the powers of heaven are shaking. Keep your lamps all trimmed and burning, ready for your Lord's returning. Lo, he comes, lo, Jesus comes. Lo, he comes all glorious. Jesus comes to reign victorious. Lo, he comes, yes, Jesus comes. Lo, the promise of your Savior, pardon sin and purchase favor, blood-washed robes and crowns of glory, haste to tell redemption's story. Lo, he comes, lo, Jesus comes. Lo, he comes all glorious. Jesus comes to reign victorious. Lo, he comes, yes, Jesus comes. Kingdoms at their base are crumbling, hark the chariot wheels are rumbling. Tell, oh tell, of grace abounding, while the seventh trump is sounding. Lo, he comes, Lord Jesus comes. Lo, he comes all glorious. Jesus comes to reign victorious. Lo, he comes, yes, Jesus comes. Nations wane, though proud and stately, Christ his kingdom hasteneth greatly. Earth her latest pangs is summing. Shout, ye saints, your Lord is coming. Lo, he comes, Lord Jesus comes. Lo, he comes all glorious. Jesus comes to reign victorious. Lo, he comes, yes, Jesus comes. Sinners come while Christ is pleading now for you. He's interceding. Haste ere grace and time diminish shall proclaim the mystery finished. Lo, he comes, Lord Jesus comes. Lo, he comes all glorious. Jesus comes to reign victorious. Lo, he comes, yes, Jesus comes. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this wonderful bonding experience that's allowed us to get to know each other and become much more familiar with your word and you as the author of it and inhabiting it. Now I pray, Lord, bless each of us that have come here. May it have stirred an interest to start studying it again. And I'm praying for all those that are watching who couldn't be here but have been blessed by the technological bridge. And so now, Lord, I'm praying, may the continued study lead us to that reformation, that revival that your word will indeed create in individual hearts and in corporate bodies, in churches. Bring us back to the roots with the advantage of the present and the anticipation of the future is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Feel free to come visit with the scholars as they're able to stay. God bless you, and we're so glad you made this part of your journey. If you want to make a donation, there are tithe envelopes. You can put them in one of the pastor's hands. Thank you for coming.